You know, when you think about a country's most important founding documents, you probably picture something old, locked away under glass, right? Well, in Canada, some of the most important ones aren't like that at all. They are living, breathing agreements signed centuries ago that are still shaping the country's laws, its land, and its relationships today. We're going to dive into the unfinished promise of Canada's treaties.
So, let's kick things off with a big question, one that really frames this entire discussion. Are a country's founding documents ever truly finished? I mean, this gets right to the heart of what a nation is and what it promises to all of its people.
In Canada, the answer to that is a hard no. See, treaties aren't just static artifacts from the past. They are the very foundation of a dynamic, ongoing relationship between Indigenous nations and the Crown, a conversation that is still unfolding right now.
Okay, so to really get our heads around this, we've got to unpack what these treaties actually mean, because this isn't just about the words written on paper, it's about the very foundation of a relationship between nations.
And it all starts with this absolutely crucial concept: inherent rights. What does that mean? Well, simply put, these are the rights Indigenous peoples have just because they were here first, governing themselves on these lands long before Canada was even a thought. So treaties aren't the Crown giving rights, they are agreements between sovereign nations.
So, the first big move from the Crown side was the Royal Proclamation of 1763. And honestly, this thing was a total game changer. It formally recognized Indigenous title to their lands and set a massive rule. Only the Crown could negotiate for that land. This basically set the stage for every single treaty that came after.
So, this proclamation laid out a historical blueprint for the country. But as that blueprint started getting filled in, well, it turned into a story of promises made and, way too often, promises broken.
This timeline right here really shows you how it all played out. First, you've got the 1763 proclamation, setting the stage. Then, jump forward to 1850, and you get the Robinson Treaties, which kind of created the template for a lot of future agreements. And then, starting in 1871, come the 11 numbered treaties. These are the ones that opened up the West and the North for the expansion of Canada.
Now, this is where it gets super interesting, because you can see how the Crown's motivations completely shifted over time. That first wave of numbered treaties, it was all about getting settlers onto the land and building that cross-country railway. But by the second wave, the mission had changed. It was almost entirely about getting access to natural resources up north. And yeah, this is where that promise really started to fall apart. This quote just hits so hard because it captures a tragic reality. So many treaty promises were just not kept. A really devastating example is the promise of schools. Indigenous leaders fought for education for their children, but the federal government twisted that promise to create the residential school system, a total and profound betrayal of the treaty's original spirit.
For decades, it felt like these broken promises were just ignored by Canadian law. But then, in the 20th century, something shifted. A constitutional turning point finally gave Indigenous rights some real legal muscle.
And that turning point? It's called Section 35 of the Constitution Act of 1982. This one sentence, this single sentence, changed everything. It recognized and affirmed the existing treaty and Aboriginal rights of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, and it baked them right into the highest law of the land.
And this slide does a great job of breaking down why Section 35 is so incredibly powerful. First off, and this is key, it doesn't give anyone rights, it just confirms the rights that were always there. It covers all Aboriginal peoples and, this is huge, it allows these rights to evolve with the times. Plus, it can't be overridden by the government's notwithstanding clause, which gives it this unique protected strength.
So, with Section 35 locked in, the Supreme Court started building out this new legal framework, one landmark case at a time. It started with the Sparrow decision, which set up a test for when the government could legally interfere with rights. Then came Delgamuukw, a massive leap forward that defined Aboriginal title as a right to the land itself and, get this, forced courts to accept oral histories as valid evidence. This all built up to the Silcocan decision, which for the first time in Canadian history actually declared Aboriginal title.
Okay, so all of this legal evolution really paved the way for a whole new era of treaty making. So, what does the path forward actually look like now? Let's dive into modern treaties and the, let's be honest, really complex work of reconciliation.
This table lays out the difference so clearly. It's like night and day, really. You look at the historic treaties, which were about settlement and basic rights. Now compare that to modern ones, which are these comprehensive agreements dealing with stuff like self-government and resource management. And maybe the biggest change of all, Indigenous peoples are no longer required to surrender their rights. These are partnership agreements now, with detailed roadmaps for how they'll actually work.
And look, this isn't just some abstract idea. We're talking about 27 modern treaties being put into practice right now, all across Canada. To put that in perspective, these agreements cover something like 40% of the country's entire landmass. That's huge. It represents a massive, ongoing shift in the whole relationship.
So what's guiding this new path? A big piece of the puzzle is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or as you'll hear it called, UNDRIP. This international framework is all about affirming the fundamental right of Indigenous peoples to self-determination, the right to control their own political, economic, and cultural futures.
A core principle of UNDRIP, and you'll hear this acronym a lot, is FPIC, Free, Prior, and Informed Consent. And let's be super clear. This isn't just about consulting. It's way deeper. It means consent has to be given freely, without pressure. It has to be sought way in advance. People have to be fully informed. And, this is the kicker, it means Indigenous peoples have the right to say yes or no.
But, and this is a big but, even with all these new frameworks in place, there's still a massive gap between the promises on paper and what people are actually experiencing on the ground. You see it in recent court cases like Shot Both Sides versus Canada just in 2024. The court flat out acknowledged the Crown's dishonorable conduct in breaking treaty promises, but legal roadblocks meant there was no real fix, which just shows you the challenges that are still there.
So how do we start to close that gap? Well, a huge part of the answer lies in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action. They really lay out a roadmap for a new kind of relationship, one built on mutual trust and respect. And right at the core of it all is the demand to finally honor the treaties as they were meant to be. Which brings us right here to this final, critical question. It's the tension at the heart of this whole story. When you have rights that are affirmed in law, but they're still being broken in practice, what does reconciliation truly demand from all of us? It's a question that sits at the very center of Canada's unfinished promise.